This is the Art of Darkness podcast with Kevin Kautzman.
And Brad Kelly. We're a couple of very online writers interested in the dark side of what drives creative people to create against all odds.
This show is about art and the people who make it, what it costs them, and what it takes to bring something unique and impactful into the world.
Each episode, we excavate the life and work of an artist you might think you know.
Don't worry, they're all safely dead.
On every episode, we try and find out just what the hell was wrong with them and how they worked through their darkness to create something that lives on after them and continues to move culture.
Find us online at artofdarkpod.com and on Twitter at artofdarkpod. And we're back.
We're back. We're back talking about...
Back to back.
That's right. We were just with you. This is Art of Darkness, your favorite podcast, your favorite podcast about the dark side.
Full stop. Period.
Yeah, full stop. Just in general. You can just unsubscribe from everybody else and stay here with us. No, just kidding. We love the podcastosphere.
Yeah, the podosphere.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So much good stuff out there.
Much like Edward de Vere, we're contributing neologisms to the English language.
Yeah, exactly. And if you heard that name, Edward de Vere, and of course you clicked on this link, so you kind of know something that we're going to talk about. This is a sort of a special little project we're running here at Art of Darkness Studios. Kevin has just recently...
scheme, even. We're doing a scheme, as they would say in the old country. Yeah,
that's right. Kevin has just recently released, or we recorded an episode, a Kevin helmed episode on William Shakespeare, the man from Stratford. Gave that the Art of Darkness treatment, as we always do, telling the life story as much as we can in the time allotted, and talking about the work and all of that. And now we're following it up with an episode on a man named Edward de Vere, the 17th Earl of Oxford. And the reason we're covering him is because some people don't like that story Kevin told, and they have good reason. And I'm going to walk you through that.
You're
they
telling
think
me
it's this other joker.
Yeah, you're telling me a semi-educated commoner from a largely illiterate family in the country, who apparently was born and died on the National Saint Day, maybe was a fabrication, maybe was a pseudonym or a nom de plume. Listen, I gave the regime history. I gave the court history. I suffered for you because I would be the one that normally would want to wear the tinfoil hat, right? And of course, this is all very political because the Oxfordians sort of are, elite theorists who say, well, no, there's no way this common man from Stratford wrote these 35, 40 odd plays. Many
Also
of which
sonnets.
are, and the sonnets. So Brad is going to give the alternative history, the X-Files history.
That's right.
Of Edward de Vere for your listening pleasure on Art of Darkness. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and so as we get into it, I mean, Kevin, I'm just going to kick it to you. What do you know about Edward de Vere, the 17th Earl of Oxford?
All right. On our core episodes, we always ask that question, and then we try to, when we remember, we try to close with the what would they be doing now? Well, what do I know about the 17th Earl of Oxford? Hereditary nobility because of the name, I suppose. Oxford is lovely. You can go see Tolkien's grave there. You can go hang out in the little booth where he and C.S. Lewis would have a pint or two, and I assume talk trash in their English way and their professorial way, their pedagogical trash talk, straight out of Stratford. Straight out of Oxford. Listen, I want this to be we got to up the kayfabe a little bit here, Brad. Right? I really got to back my guy. I am with the man from Stratford, but you're going to try to convince us that he never really existed. And this fellow de Vere is one of the primary suspects as per who actually wrote the works of Willie Shakes that are attributed to the great Willie Shakes. I don't know much more about him, Brad. I assume he was up to no good. probably had a lot of spare time on his hands, and probably spent a lot of time counting money and not working and getting into a little bit of trouble. But that I really don't know anything, so I am excited to learn along with the Art of Darkness audience.
Okay, cool. Yeah. So this is going to be this episode is going to be a little bit different than how we normally do it. I will spend a lot of time giving the biography as it is documented of Edward de Vere, 17th Earl of Oxford. I have to. I was joking to myself
That's a
that
lot of
like
Earls of Oxford.
it's
That's
a
a lot.
lot.
That's
Well,
crazy that they can pass that down. I mean, you got to be having sons and having sons. Yeah,
yeah, one of the things they talk about in the biography is like it was unusual because there wasn't really the 17th anything at that point. Like everybody was like the
sure.
second or the
Right.
third, and
Yeah.
yeah,
If he had one more Earl of Oxford, the Earl of Oxford would be of age. Right.
yeah,
He could vote.
and like 50 or well, less than 100 years after his death, they had to start over again. We're not going to talk about that, but
Oh,
then you get
okay.
back to the first Earl of Oxford,
Right.
for
Right.
whatever
I
reason.
see. I see.
Yeah,
Well, and it's
um,
worth it bears saying that that's a good school. It is.
it
It's a good
is.
ancient school. It's
Yeah,
very
indeed.
high. It tends to be very high on the lists of good
It
schools.
does. Yeah, it does.
Yeah.
And they got a
Hmm.
great they got a great comma too.
Oh, we are Oxford comma
I'm an Oxford
appreciators
comma
on that.
guy. Yeah,
That's really
yeah,
ladies at
yeah.
Art of Dark Pod on Twitter. You want to argue with Brad about whether or not the Oxford comma should exist at all. Um, and not to be
Yeah.
confused with the Cambridge colon.
That's a even weirder move. So
That's something Oscar Wilde would be interested in.
that's right. That's right. So, yeah. So as I was saying, this episode is going to be a little different. We're gonna tell the life story, but I'm going to kind of tee it up, sort of like justify why are we even talking about this? Because the mainstream theory is the mainstream notion is that this Edward de Vere stuff is just hogwash. It's just conspiracy theorizing. It's JFK was assassinated by Bigfoot level stuff. Um, I think we're going to prove. I think we're going to indicate that there is a lot more here than maybe some people want to admit. So what I'm going to start is I'm going to try to give you. There is so much to this. The rabbit hole is so deep. To some extent, we're going to be kind of skipping across the surface, but I'm going to try to give you handful of the best arguments that I found as to why William Shakespeare, the man from Stratford, didn't write the plays. And then I'm going to try to give you the best arguments that I've come across as to why Edward de Vere did. And
So
then from that,
we're gonna run the whole gamut here. We're gonna straw man it. We're gonna steel man it. We're
yeah,
gonna do the we're gonna shake it. We're
yeah,
gonna shake our spears in all directions. I'm
yeah,
excited.
yes,
This is good.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. And
and we
I
have no.
should,
And by the way, we have no skin in the game. I mean, I know we're plebeians,
mhm,
peasants from the country. So well, I'm more from the country than you, but we're from the middle of fucking
yeah,
nowhere, and we're
yeah,
writers. So I mean,
yeah.
theoretically, we should, sort of side on the Stratfordians. But I don't really have. I don't have any skin in this game, and
No.
having grown up in the country around those people, maybe they couldn't. Maybe there's something to be said. I certainly can't write
Well,
a
right.
Hamlet, I mean,
I
I do my
got it.
best, but
I spent 11 years in college and I can't write Shakespeare stuff. So,
mhm,
uh,
sure. Yeah, but you
so,
didn't go to
um,
Oxford,
well, that's true. That's true.
but neither did
Um,
Shakespeare.
well, exactly. That's the
Ah,
point. Okay.
okay.
Just kind of as a setup, one thing, the theory isn't that William Shakespeare, the person, didn't exist. That's not the theory. The theory is that the plays and poems were not written by the man that was William Shakespeare, the man from Stratford. I'm going to do an Oxfordian thing here to just try to keep it clear. With the Oxfordians, and that's for people. Oxfordians are people who think Edward de Vere wrote the plays, and Stratfordians are people who think the common story, the regime's story of who the man is. They refer Oxfordians refer to that man, the Stratford man, as William Shakespeare, and that's because that's how it was. That's much closer to how it was commonly spelled in the legal documentation that referred to him. And then Shakespeare, William Shakespeare, that refers to whoever it is who wrote the plays and the poems. That could be Shakespeare, that could be Edward de Vere, that could be Francis Bacon, or a number of other people, right? So I'm going to kind of refer to Shakespeare. That's a real guy who existed, and Shakespeare is the writer, whoever he happened to be. Okay, so uh, here, so we're starting with why is Shakespeare, not Shakespeare. This is, I'm going to give you the best arguments that I've kind of come across. The first one is there are no documents, according to the Oxfordians, and the Stratfordians haven't done a very good job of coming up with counterexamples. There are no documents that link Shakespeare to Shakespeare during the writer's lifetime. Yeah.
Okay. Is that so? We have on my episode, the core episode that I did recently, which I would say maybe listen to that one first, although you could probably listen to them out of order. I give, as we say, the regime history of the man from Stratford, Willie Shakes, the William Shakespeare that we all sort of know and recognize. We talked about Kidd and Marlowe. We talked about especially Marlowe. Is there a bunch of documentation for those fellows?
Yes.
There's but not for my guy. Okay.
Yeah. So there's a researcher who, of course, the Stratfordians dislike and probably even have a time or two disparage. There's a researcher named Diana Price who followed this exact line of reasoning. She kind of encountered this notion that there's no Shakespeare documents as a writer, and what I mean by that is contracts for writing stuff, getting paid to write stuff, drafts that say William Shakespeare on them, manuscripts found in his house. There's no evidence that Shakespeare ever bought a book ever or owned a book at all. There are no letters in Shakespeare's hand, let alone a letter that says, hey, by the way, I'm working on Hamlet, I'm almost done. There's nothing like that. But if you go to somebody like Thomas Kidd, John Nash, Christopher Marlowe, I think she did 12. I think she looked at the documentation for 12 other well-known writers living that were contemporaneous with Shakespeare. They all have tons of stuff. There's all kinds of letters, correspondences, just friendly letters. Like if you know another writer and it's like, hey, bud, how you doing on the thing? Oh, the project's going really well. Ah, great. Like nothing even, they have all kinds of stuff, right? Diana Price, the way she phrases it is, if writing a play was a crime, there's not enough documentation to convict William Shakespeare of the crime of writing the plays of William Shakespeare. That's the way that she phrases it.
That is what excuse for that? Because as somebody who studied history, we talk. I mean, real serious. I've never been an historian. I've studied history, but people who make history, actually, the act of producing history. Real serious historical scholarship is about primary sources. And if there are none, what is all this stuff based on? Hearsay and gobbledygook and okay, fun.
Right.
Yeah, you're telling me that William Shakespeare, the man from Stratford, was a psyop?
Yeah, that's sort of the Oxfordian stance, and we're going to get to like, well, what's the point of making all of this up? We will get there, because there has to be a motive.
He's like almost like the Mickey Mouse of his time, right? Like we created this figment of our imaginations and associated with him with the English nation itself, and this is our national poet. I could see why you would possibly do that. Go on, Brad. I am riveted.
So there are apparently 90 documents with the name Shakespeare on them, or some variation of that, published during the writer's lifetime. None of them actually tie in a behind-the-scenes way. At one point, the early epic poem Venus and Adonis had the name William Shakespeare on it during his lifetime, and some other things were publicly facing that said William Shakespeare on it. But if you think of if it is being used as a pseudonym, one of they think Mark Twain is a pseudonym, right? You can't see a book on the shelf that says Mark Twain and say, oh, well, there must be a guy named Mark Twain, right? And then if you look in the phone book and there happens to be a person named Mark Twain, you can't say, well, that's clearly the guy that wrote Huckleberry Finn. You need more connective tissue between these things, right? To validate the whole thing. But that by itself, okay, maybe all of the records and every letter he ever wrote to somebody else somehow all burned up in a fire. Okay, whatever. Let's get into the education thing.
Yeah, but he would have written letters to other people, and other
that
people
would be out disseminated.
He would have been a man of letters, and if his colleagues were, and then we have a record of that, and we don't have a record of any of his, that is a very sus fact.
And people would have been even if it wasn't about him, people would have been writing letters to each other. Like Did you see the thing our buddy William Shakespeare wrote? The only thing you get public facing, you'll get some reviews of stuff he's done. But again, a review in the newspaper, that doesn't mean the reviewer knows anything about the real person behind. You can review a book and have zero knowledge about the person who wrote it, right? But again, by itself, not quite enough. But this education component is really important. This is where the accusations of classism come in. People say, well, you're thinking that it's an elitist position. It's a snobbish position to think that somebody with an elite education is the only person capable of writing this work. And I was sympathetic to that kind of Stratfordian counter argument at first. But the general agreement is among everybody is that Shakespeare, whoever wrote these plays, was not only pretty well educated, he was probably the most literate person alive in his time. So it's one thing to be something like an idiot savant and say you teach yourself to play the guitar and you're just amazing. It's another thing when you're making obscure references to Italian art. You can't idiot savant that. Right? You can't
yeah. Did he ever visit Italy? Would a common man from Stratford have the means to do so? And you think there'd be a record of it?
There's no evidence that Shakespeare traveled to Italy or ever left the island of England. At all. And Stratfordians don't even claim that he did.
Yeah, island of Britain. You're going to piss some people off.
Sorry. Yes. The nation of England at that time.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. Right. So
we must not forget the Welsh.
Right.
Hello.
Fair enough.
Brad's like, well, I don't fucking care. I don't know.
I'm Irish. As far as I care,
you're on the other island.
I'm on the other island. The rest of them can sink as far as I'm concerned. No, I'm just kidding.
Okay. At Art of Dark Pod on Twitter if you want to get
we
Brad.
We love
all of our friends from the old country. We have some.
Take some pot shots at America.
Listen, we deserve, and the Irish for that matter.
And the Irish, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, nobody gets off scot-free. Okay, now it's not just that he didn't, Shakespeare didn't maybe have the greatest education. There's no documented evidence. There's no actual documents. There's circumstantial evidence that he went to the Stratford Grammar School because, as Kevin said in our previous episode, his father was essentially the mayor of Stratford. And that is probably true, but we don't actually know that as a fact. Interestingly, Alexander Waugh, who is not only, I think he's the grandson or the grandnephew of Evelyn Waugh, the author of Brideshead Revisited. Alexander Waugh is a prominent Oxfordian, and the way he lays it out and the research he's done is he basically says that the Shakespeare line goes illiterate, Shakespeare's father, most literate man of all time, genius playwright, and then a bunch of illiterate children. That doesn't make any sense.
Doesn't add up.
Right? I mean, and it's not like in the argument isn't that Shakespeare, the Stratfordian argument isn't that Shakespeare was a penniless, unrecognized in his time. He was thought to be a reasonably successful man within the, or even more so in the theatrical community, as well as a successful businessman and a couple of different fronts. So there's no reason that he couldn't have supported at least one of his children into having a rudimentary level of literacy, right? It just doesn't make any sense.
Well, hang on. And so let's also say, like, there were some weird things in my episode that had me going, wait a minute. So he had his first son and then twins, and then just left his wife in Stratford, a 2-day voyage. I mean, by today's terms, that would be like you're from New Zealand and you go to London because you got to make it and you leave your family behind. It just seems like it would have been totally scandalous, super unusual. There are holes in the story. Yeah, I'm the door is cracking open here, Brad.
Okay.
The curtain, the kilt is being lifted. The stage door, the trap door is opening a little bit here. I'm willing to concede a little bit of what you're throwing down here.
Okay, good, because I got more. Okay. Now,
Okay.
staying on this education thing just briefly.
Wait, now on the
Go ahead.
counter argument,
Mhm,
the counter
mhm.
argument is our parents weren't podcasters, and I pray to God that our children won't be podcasters either.
Yeah, but
So
that's like saying my parents didn't have typhoid and I do, and then my children didn't. It's
that's
like that's how you
exactly what it that's
yeah.
exactly what it's like.
It's like that's a win. That's a you barely survived the evolutionary
Totally.
charnel house, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Yeah. Go
yeah,
on, Brad.
yeah. So now here's the thing. I think I did mention this, but let me just hit this point a little bit harder. There's also no evidence that Shakespeare ever owned a book. For other writers, you have documents for them ordering books and owning books. And it's not like now where you get a bunch of books and then every once in a while you're like, you know what? I don't need this shelf. And you just like give them to Goodwill. Books were expensive and they were not only valuable monetarily, but they were sort of valuable. You couldn't just get another copy necessarily, right? And in Shakespeare's will, he doesn't mention his books at all. He must have been reading something, right? Because even the genius, even the idea that he's this just savant genius has the Stratfordian argument that he's this just he's channeling it. It still requires him to be at least somewhat well read. He still has to have read some stuff. All of his material is drawn from other sources, as we know. So how can he be both sort of just channeling this from the heavens, this once in a species, genius, but also always drawing from previous sources at the same time, but never own any books. It doesn't quite add up, right? Um, uh, yeah. Now I want to just like put a parenthesis on this issue of him educated. Trust me, nobody wants more than me just a podunk dude from the country to be the greatest writer of all time. I am so on that team. It's just I don't
Yeah, we
quite
have no
buy
skin
it.
in the game here. Yeah.
Yeah,
Right.
right,
Yeah.
right. I just don't. It just doesn't quite work for me. Um, Now here is this next sort of argument is very closely related to the previous, but it's not so much about education as it is about life experience. If you go into a great library that has a sort of a Shakespeare section, there will be all kinds of books, not only on Shakespeare, not only on individual plays, not only on themes and historical context, but there'll be books on Shakespeare and the law, Shakespeare and the military, Shakespeare and a variety of subjects. The argument is that he demonstrates a masterful knowledge of all kinds of different things. Now, Kevin, in the episode you did, you mentioned how many plants he seemed to know. Fine for a country boy. How does he know all of this legal stuff? How does he know all of this military stuff? How does he know all this astronomy stuff? How does he know so much about falconry, which is a hobby that was reserved for the elites? How does he know a little bit of Latin? How does he know Greek? How does he know enough Latin and Greek to pull Latin and Greek into the English language in a way that's so functional we still use a lot of it today? Where does he pick up any of this stuff, right? You have to pick it up someplace. And there's not a great argument for how Shakespeare could have pulled that off. There's just the Stratfordians just sort of kind of hand wave it, to be honest, and they'll say he was a legal clerk for a while. Well, how is he a legal clerk while he was also holding the reins at the theater for audience members? Holding the horses for audience members. How was he doing both of those at the same time? Was he also in the military while he was doing it? When was he doing all of this stuff? So that's another thing. Okay,
I
now
can get behind all of that. That is, it
yeah,
is, you're starting to make a point, like in this author who I referred to, Ackroyd, the great biography, very, very solid, the man who clearly is in love
yeah,
with history and love with the history of London, very readable book. He plays up all of the fact that, yeah, he knows all of this botany and all of these names for plants and things from the country. Well,
mhm,
wouldn't a nobleman with a country home also, know those things and then also know
right,
about war and the military and legal
right,
matters? And yeah, you're right.
right.
They're kind of,
Right. Well,
they're
and then here's the other thing. Like, even if you don't know about them, okay, so Kevin, right now you're trying to write something. Let's say you need to know about some technical subject you don't know about. You go and look on the internet, right? Well, what you would do in that time is you would either find a book which he didn't apparently own any books as far as we can tell, or you would write somebody who knows about it. And he apparently never wrote anybody any letters. So how is he getting any of this? If it's not life experience, where is he getting any of it from? Right. That's the sort of argument about experience. Now,
source, it came to me in a dream. Source, ye old dream.
Right. Now, you can poke holes in this, and you could say, as part of as a part of a collaborative effort, well, he's involved in the theater and other people knew about this stuff and contributed to it. I'm cool with that. If somebody wants to make that argument and draw those lines and say, hey, Christopher Marlowe or whoever knew about this thing and he talked to them, I'm on board with that. I haven't heard any of the Stratfordians make that argument. Maybe it's out there. Okay. Now, here's another thing. This isn't any kind of proof, but let me just try to legitimize the anti-Stratfordian take. Not so much the Oxfordian, but the anti-Stratfordian take. A lot of people don't know that Mark Twain's final book is entitled Is Shakespeare Dead?, which lended tentative support to the Francis Bacon side of things. Book was not well understood or received, but it was there. Sigmund Freud, who was deeply influenced in the development of psychoanalytic theory by the play Hamlet and wrote widely on Shakespeare. He read Shakespeare. He thought the Earl of Oxford made an excellent Hamlet. He believed that it was De Vere. Charles Dickens also was skeptical of the Stratfordian narrative. Nathaniel Hawthorne, Thomas Hardy. Note, these are all writers, right? These are people who understand what it takes to write something. Oliver Wendell Holmes, Samuel Coleridge, Walt Whitman, Otto von Bismarck. I don't know how that matters that much, but it's there. Benjamin Disraeli, James Joyce, Charlie Chaplin.
Wait.
Wells.
These people thought it was De Vere?
These people, some of them thought it was De Vere, but they all were skeptical of the man from Stratford hypothesis. They were all skeptical that Shakespeare was Shakespeare.
Fascinating.
Yeah, and there's more. John Galsworthy, Daphne du Maurier, Helen Keller, Henry James. Henry James said, "quote."
Well, Helen Keller never existed. That's we'll just leave that there. Oh, I heard on the internet. Right. Yeah, she's another one. You don't know.
Yeah. Well, Go on. Henry James said, "quote, I am haunted by the conviction that the Divine William is the biggest and most successful fraud ever practiced." That was Henry James. Here we go. So here's just a little bit that kind of summarizes a little bit on this note of just people who it's not just weirdos in tinfoil hats, right? This is Hugh Trevor Roper, who is a history professor at the Oxford University. He found Shakespeare's elusiveness, quote, exasperating and almost incredible. After all, he lived in the full daylight of the English Renaissance in the well-documented reigns of Queen Elizabeth and King James I, and since his death has been subjected to the greatest battery of organized research that has ever been directed upon a single person, and yet the greatest of all Englishmen, after this tremendous inquisition, still remains so close to a mystery that even his identity can still be doubted. Okay. Now let's look at
again. I don't know. Are we going to settle on De Vere? But I'm 100% with you here now, because it's as we've seen of late in contemporary life, even the present is fabricated.
Right.
And that is gnarly. Every day that goes by, the Hall of Mirrors behind us gets more twisted and more twisted and more twisted. And I'm really curious, because you're going to, like we said, you're going to straw man and you're going to steel man this. So I'm very curious to hear the steel man arguments for the man from Stratford.
Oh man. Well, this is the problem. I don't think I can. I don't know I don't know all the Stratfordian arguments I've heard have been like, well, he just was. They're not great.
That fucking rocks. That's
they
amazing,
might be
dude.
out there, but I've not been persuaded.
Let me say too, we love hearing opinions from people, as long as they are in good faith and they're not catty or ad hominem in terms of the show. We love hearing from people. T.me/Art of Dark Pod. Get in the Telegram chat. Tell people your opinion. Is it De Vere? Is it
Yeah.
somebody else? Is it Willie Shakes? Tell people about your favorite pen. As soon as you join the chat, you will immediately have a new set of crazy Art of Darkness friends. Do that.
Yeah.
Come to the show that we're doing, the live show on October 26th in Hamtramck, Detroit. We're doing The Death of Harry Houdini. That is going to be a lot of fun. It's going to be a Halloween party. Tickets are going to go on sale soon. Find Brad at Art of Dark Pod on Twitter. We are at artofdarkpod@gmail.com if you want to email us. And seriously, if you have inside or other ideas or inside baseball about this stuff, we love hearing from people.
Yeah, we take a month or a little more to prepare these episodes, and I spent, in that month, all I listened to were talks about this. All I read was stuff about this, and maybe there's something I'm missing. I haven't seen it though, about the pro Stratfordian side. Yeah. So let's talk about one more thing. Let's be a little bit more specific. We'll talk about the first folio and as it relates to Ben Jonson. So this kind of relates to this notion of how sort of legends and icons are born, right? They, of course, they have their life and the work that they created, but they also need to have an afterlife, right? With certain kinds of milestones, right? You think about how Marilyn Monroe, she had her life, but then she died, and then there's a legend of her that expands, and there's stuff that people are watching her old films that maybe didn't get the notice that they did, and people are hanging up posters, and it builds and builds and builds. For instance, Bloomsday, June 16th, which just passed, wasn't a big deal in London a year after the first Bloomsday, right? But there was a little group while Joyce was alive. But then in 1954, the 50th anniversary, some Joyce lovers got together. And then in 1994, it started being a big celebration, right? It took, almost 100 years before Bloomsday was a thing, right? Similar for Shakespeare, there are landmarks after his life that are significant for building him into the great poet. And the most important of these, the work that gave Shakespeare a place on any respectable shelf, was the first folio, which was published in 1623, 7 years after Shakespeare's death. This included 36 Shakespeare plays, 18 of which had not been previously published. They'd been performed, but had not been published hadn't been able to buy them. And including the previously unpublished included The Tempest, Twelfth Night, Macbeth, Julius Caesar. These had not, if you hadn't seen them at the Globe or somewhere, you missed them, right? Great. This thing comes out. What's the problem with it? Well, according to Oxfordian researchers, there's a lot wrong with it. They point out a bunch of stuff. None of it is really conclusive taken together, but it might make somebody raise their eyebrows about, like, what's going on here? First, there's no biographical information in the book. It's the collected works of Shakespeare. It doesn't say anything about him except that he's dead. Doesn't give you a birth date, doesn't give you a death date. Okay. It doesn't include the newly acquired Shakespeare coat of arms. Okay. Ben Jonson, one of the men who put together much of the front matter, the poems and introduction. In his poem, he calls him the sweet swan of Avon. But as Kevin, you mentioned in our episode, Avon just means river. There were like a couple dozen Avon rivers in the country. And Avon is also the name for the Hampton Court where Queen Elizabeth hosted court theatricals. He might have been sweet swan of the Queen's Theater. That may be all it means. Maybe.
He might have delivered modestly priced home goods to the ladies in his neighborhood in a kind of MLM direct-to-consumer marketing scheme.
Right.
He may have been an Avon lady. The sweet swan.
I think. Yeah. And in the After Dark, we'll talk about his products. No,
we'll talk about right.
We'll talk about Avon.
We'll tell you how you can make an income at home selling toilet paper to the friends that you want to estrange in your cul-de-sac. Avon awesome. Ladies. Remember Avon ladies? You don't hear about Avon ladies much anymore.
You don't. No. Yeah. Deep into this, into the prefatory material of the first folio, we get the first connection between Shakespeare and Stratford. And this is when the poet Leonard Digges refers to, quote, thy Stratford monument in the present tense, as though there's a monument to Shakespeare in Stratford. Now, according to the Oxfordians, Stratford was one of a dozen or so small towns scattered across the country named Stratford. Stratford upon Avon, 4 days away from London on foot, was not particularly prominent among the many Stratfords, apparently. Further, Digges says monument. He says a Shakespeare monument in Stratford. But so there must be a statue of some kind. But the Oxfordians claim that in those early pilgrimages, people started making a pilgrimage as early as 1625. People merely found a monument to a wool dealer named William Shakespeare, and the guy looked nothing like the portrait that they had seen in the first folio. Oxfordians showed documentary evidence of this. And basically show how the current monument was modified to look like a writer. It was a dude with a big sack of wool. This is what the Oxfordians will claim. And then they
modified it. Fascinating. Of course, his father, according to the court history, which I gave on the other episode, got into some trouble for illegally trading wool. He was a glover. Yes. Yeah. But he was
some Oxfordians. Some Oxfordians say the monument is actually of his father. It just says Shakespeare.
Right. How would we know? Right. And that would make sense if he was the mayor of the town, right? He was sort of the man. Interesting. Okay. Yeah. Wool, people don't know this, but wool was the crypto of the 16th century.
Wool was the crypto of the time. Yeah. Except it was founded in reality.
I'm sure the sheep didn't think so.
Well, that's true.
Yeah.
What is this business?
The metaphysics of wool. Is it founded in reality? We don't have time for this shit.
No. We got a lot to get through here.
We got business. We got show business to do.
That's right. Now, the portrait in the folio, this is the first time there's ever any kind of portrait of Shakespeare. If people look this up, it's the Droeshout portrait, or the first folio portrait. Some Oxfordians point to various oddities, including the shape of his head and the fact that his outfit is tailored to show 2 left arms, no right. He doesn't write. He doesn't have a right. He's got 2 left arms. There was a follow-up portrait a few years later in another document that similarly shows him basically sort of almost like a visual pun. He does not have a right arm. And it's not a realistic portrait. It's on the edge of being a caricature. And interestingly enough, Droeshout, up until that time, had engraved very naturalistic portraits. So kind of what's up with that? There's a lot of other stuff in here. We could spend 4 hours on the first folio poking holes into why it's not maybe exactly what it seems at first, according to the Oxfordians. But let me give you this. This is written by Ben Jonson, and this was on the page facing the Droeshout portrait, this sort of very sus portrait of Shakespeare. This quote, this figure that thou here seest put, it was for gentle Shakespeare cut, wherein the graver had a strife with nature to outdo the life. Oh, could he but have drawn his wit as well in brass as he hath hit his face, the print would then surpass all that was ever writ in brass. But since he cannot, reader, look not on his picture, but his book. Oxfordians will claim that basically what Ben Jonson, who is known to be a sort of a trickster and satirist in print, is basically saying that's not actually him. Look not on his picture, but at his book. That's not the guy who wrote these. Is what the Oxfordians will claim Ben Jonson is doing. Now, they also point to contradictions between descriptions of Shakespeare in the folio and in previous texts, such as implying he was dead. There are earlier texts you can find that imply that Shakespeare was dead at least as early as 1609, if not before. Remember, the official story is William Shakespeare died in 1616. Go ahead.
We've got it's kind of a Banksy thing going on, isn't it? That could it could be like the Banksy of its time.
A little bit. There's something to that. I think there's something to that.
And of course, we know Banksy is just the massive attack guys. So
probably something like that. Banksy's whoever you want him to be.
Banksy can be anybody.
That's what's good.
Banksy is everything that Flyover chuds are not. That is what Banksy stands for. So I don't know. I
Oh
don't know how
man.
I feel, but yeah, there you go. But I mean, the
Um,
point is, if it could be pulled off now with all of the surveillance media and all the other stuff that we have, all the technology, it sure as hell could have been pulled off then.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, for
easily.
sure, for sure.
Probably easily.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Hmm.
Now, I got a bunch of other stuff loaded up to talk about how Shakespeare wasn't Shakespeare, and maybe we'll get to it if we do. That is but so far right now, that's my, hey, maybe Shakespeare wasn't Shakespeare argument. Okay. Now, the follow-up, that doesn't have anything to do with it being De Vere. The follow-up is what is the evidence that it was possibly this Edward de Vere fella? Again, this is all circumstantial, but some of it definitely makes you go, hmm. Uh, okay, first, uh, the folio. Um, well, yeah, okay. So we'll talk about the folio because we just talked about the folio, so we're kind of on it. Um, First off, Shakespeare. Interesting name, right? You could see how that would be, forget about what we know about Shakespeare. You could see how somebody's pseudonym would be Shakespeare. It's a pretty good name, right? Um, and somebody who shakes their spear, shaking your spear, the Oxfordians will say that sounds like a jouster. That sounds like somebody who played in the games, right? They either did it militarily or they did it in the games. Well, Edward de Vere won numerous tournaments jousting. Okay, so that's just one thing. Just immediately, okay, he's kind of
That
on the
is
list.
gnarly. Have you ever
Yeah,
seen people simulate jousting? Yeah.
yeah. It's wild.
No, gonna count me out. I don't think I'm
Yeah,
hanging. No, I'll
yeah,
pass.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we'll learn a little bit about the tournaments, but okay, in 1624, this is still talking about the folio, 1624, 1 year after the first folio was made available, a very slyly written book refers to some other recent significant book in circulation in which, quote, Vere has been omitted. De Vere, right? And he also talks about in this book about mistaken names. Now, why after De Vere's death would a hoax be further perpetuated, right? You can imagine a world where somebody writes behind a pseudonym, but after he's dead, why are people trying to keep up the thing? Why keep this whole hoax going, right? He's dead, right? Well, two of De Vere's son-in-laws, we'll call them the Herbert boys, they're the Earls of Pembroke and Montgomery, were the men who the first folio was dedicated to. So the first folio was dedicated to De Vere's sons-in-law. Okay. And then later, these same two men tried to block productions of the plays. So they apparently were somehow financing the first folio or in support of it or helping it. And then later they were trying to block production. Why would they do this? Well, the Oxfordian theory is they did this to prevent identification of these plays, who actually wrote them, which could have been embarrassing to the monarchy if they were known to be written by nobility
Right,
and would
because
be embarrassing to the De Vere line.
there was an incident in my recording where some noble was offended by one
Mm-hmm.
of the plays, and it caused some trouble for the company. So yeah, you could see why someone in De Vere's position
Mm-hmm.
would not want to be associated, but would still kind
Right.
of want to write. Very similar to our Anons. Shout out to
Mm-hmm.
the
Mm-hmm.
Anons.
Yeah.
On Twitter. I mean,
And
you work for a software company, you work for Google. You maybe don't want
right.
to
Yeah.
offend the
Yeah.
lords and ladies of Google HR.
Right. And Shakespeare, some dude from the country, he doesn't even know the nobility anyway. If he's the one who wrote the play, there's always this plausible deniability that it's not about whoever, right? But if it's a member of the nobility and oh, this character's kind of acting like, an advisor to the queen or whoever, then the link is right there. It's immediate and it's obvious, right? Now, but okay, why do the printing and then why later block the productions? Well, in 1623, when Shakespeare's first folio came out, there was a moment of national crisis because the king, James I, was planning to marry off his son Charles to the heir to the Catholic Habsburgs. During the approximate 20 months of printing of the folio, Henry de Vere, that's Edward de Vere's son, the 18th Earl of Oxford, was in the Tower of London for speaking out against the marriage. William and Philip Herbert, the Herbert boys, used the folio as a way to advocate for their imprisoned brother-in-law, right? Um, uh, so that's a thing. Okay. You're going to find out that a lot of the De Vere family members and descendants have odd connections to the promulgation of Shakespeare. It's very unusual. But let's back up a second. Who was the first person to say, hey, De Vere is Shakespeare? Right? Shakespeare. That's a reasonable question. It's actually kind of interesting. So De Vere was first identified as a candidate for the author in 1920 by a schoolmaster named J. Thomas Loney in his book Shakespeare Identified. He built on previous research and he developed a kind of checklist. He said, okay, the authorship was in question. People had suggested Christopher Marlowe. People had suggested Francis Bacon and others. But J. Thomas Loney, he had been working with Shakespeare as a school teacher, and he decided, well, let's kind of do almost like an FBI profiling thing. Forget who we know about him being. Based on the plays and the sonnets, what kind of person would he have to be, right? And he developed like an 18-point checklist. He didn't have any, apparently, supposedly, as he claimed, he had no preconceived notions about who it actually was. He was trying to back into it. He comes up with this list. It's, I think, 18 characteristics. William Shakespeare had none of them, effectively. The experience stuff we were talking about, the education stuff, all of that. And De Vere, who only got on his radar because J. Thomas Loney had also done an analysis of a rhyme scheme used in an early Shakespeare poem and tried to find if anybody else writing at the time used the same rhyme scheme. He found that Edward de Vere had. So he said, okay, well, what about this guy? Turns out that Edward de Vere has like 17 of the 18 characteristics or something like that Loney developed beforehand. So interesting, right? Now, what are these characteristics? Well, some of them have to do with being identified as a writer, as we've talked about in the documentation. And some of them have to do with J. Thomas Loney kind of decided he didn't have to necessarily be nobility, but he had to have familiarity with the nobility. Somebody like a chambermaid or something could have maybe done it. Somebody who had a little bit of inside baseball on the nobility, right? Not just some guy working in a farmer's field. Again, doesn't have to be nobility, but the nobility have a lot of staff around them, obviously, right? I think he kind of suggested it had to be sort of that or a stable boy and above, kind of. Let's see. Now, here's another thing. Here's another piece of evidence that I think is among the strongest pieces. De Vere's books. De Vere had books. He had a lot of books. As we said before, there's apparently, according to the Oxfordians, no documentary evidence that Shakespeare had any books. De Vere had works of Chaucer, which we know Shakespeare drew from. He had works from Plutarch, which Shakespeare drew elements of Julius Caesar, I can never say that, Coriolanus, and Merchant of Venice. Nailed it. And perhaps most importantly, and also, this is an interesting one, and it'll come up later, but I'll just say it now. There's a bit in Venus and Adonis that draws exactly from a translation of Ovid's Metamorphosis. Fine. That particular translation did not exist in the public, and it was actually a translation done by Edward de Vere's uncle. Like, yeah, nobody else could read this book except people that De Vere's
a way to
uncle
think about it.
wanted
A way
read
to think about it right now is that like De Vere was in all the group chats, and Willie Shakes was not.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Right. Now,
the man
here's
from
a good
Stratford.
One. Yeah. Yeah. Now, here's a good one. De Vere also had a Geneva Bible. That Geneva Bible is now in the Shakespeare Folger Library in Washington, D.C. I don't know why it's in the Folger Library, to be honest, but it is. And this is very interesting for the way in which it is notated. According to Alexander Waugh, the Oxfordian we talked about earlier, each and every of the 199 biblical passages noted by De Vere show up in a work of Shakespeare. Now, I think that's over exaggerating. And another source of statistical analysis was done on annotations and found the general rule to be true that the more annotated a line was, the more notes it had under it, the more underlines or whatever, the more likely it was to show up in the work of Shakespeare. So it's sort of like his writer's notebook, kind of, this Bible that happens to belong to Edward de Vere. There is a great deal of controversy about this book. outright rejections of its significance by people such as the author of this biography I'm working from. I don't think I mentioned my main. Let me mention my main sources here. I haven't really gotten to them. Mostly what I'm talking now from is sort of scattered Oxfordian sources. There's a lot of people who've dedicated a lot of time to this. I have tried to look at Stratfordian arguments, but I'm making the De Vere case, so that's where I'm going. But my primary written source is this book, Monstrous Adversary, The Life of Edward de Vere, 17th Earl of Oxford. And it's a biography of our man written by a Stratfordian. So the man that wrote this, Alan H. Nelson, does not believe de Vere was Shakespeare. And I'm using this as my primary story to tell the life story of de Vere that we're going to get into in a minute. Another source that I'm using is, what the heck is it called? It's a collection put together by William Leahy called My Shakespeare, the Authorship Controversy, that is a collection of essays, each one arguing for a different candidate for the identity of Shakespeare, including Shakespeare. Anyway, there's a great deal of controversy about this Geneva Bible that belonged to De Vere. And the Stratfordians claim that De Vere just, apparently some of the Stratfordians anyway, claim that De Vere just bought this book and it was already annotated, which could be true, but I guess he could have bought it from Shakespeare, but then he had it rebound, and I don't know if you rebind in like velvet and like your heraldic devices. I don't know if you do that with a book that somebody already wrote in. It seems kind of odd for like I don't know. But
I guess theoretically he could have like gone through the folio and like marked up what Shakespeare had referred to.
Oh
but
yeah,
that seems like a real
the folio came out like 20 years
okay, then never mind.
after Vere was dead.
I take it back. Okay.
Right.
I'm prepared to accept that Edward de Vere was Willie Shakes, okay?
Yeah,
already.
I'm not 100% on board, but there's stuff that I don't have good explanations from. Yeah.
Yeah.
And apparently
I believe every conspiracy theory that comes across the transom, Brad.
This is the problem.
I already believe that Bigfoot assassinated John F. Kennedy gone too soon.
Right.
You said it once, and I'm prepared to believe
it. No evidence. I said it as a joke. It's like it's a limited hangout right there.
For real. Yeah. Just the biggest sucker of all time. I'm just trying to fit in here in Biden's America.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. About one last thing about this Geneva Bible. Apparently, noted paleogeographer Emily Will has done an analysis on the handwriting and the annotations of the Geneva Bible and compared them to the handwriting of Edward de Vere in letters and says they're the same person wrote them. So I don't know. I'm not going to question a handwriting expert. I don't have anywhere near the expertise to do that. Now, here's the other question. Was de Vere involved in the theater? Was he a writer of any kind, right? Even if it's all a pseudonym, you'd still pick up some hints. Well, the fact is he was both involved in the theater and he was a poet. So for 2 decades, he was a patron of a number of acting companies, particularly one men's group and one boys group. And in fact, for a time, was the single most important patron of the theater in London. I am going to read a little bit from, bear with me for a second while I find my page. I'm going to read a little bit from My Shakespeare. This is the De Vere argument by Alexander Waugh. Almost there. Got a lot of threads in old Duder's head here, as you can imagine.
We do every episode. The person hosting the core episode is juggling 5 to 7 threads at a given time to try to put it all together. Yeah,
that's right.
It's pretty fun. It's fun to do.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah. It is. Here's a quote. This is Alexander Waugh talking about Edward de Vere. Quote, in 1583, Edward de Vere acquired the lease on England's first public indoor theater. That's Blackfriars. Later transferring it to his secretary, the playwright John Lilly, and Rocco Benetti, a fencing master, despised by Oxford, whose preposterous fencing terms are said to be ridiculed in Romeo and Juliet. In the 1590s, his players elected as their favorite performing space the yard, and that's his players this is Edward de Vere's troupe. elected there as their favorite performing space the yard of the Boar's Head Tavern, adjacent to Oxford's home and Great Garden east of Aldgate. For people who don't know, the boars as a symbol and all kinds of show up in Shakespeare a lot, right? This public theater shares its name and reputation for rowdiness with the infamous Boar's Head Tavern in Shakespeare's Henry IV plays, in which Falstaff and his men mount an ambush on messengers bringing money for the exchequer along the road from Rochester to Gravesend on 20th of May, an event that precisely mirrors an ambush by Oxford's men on Lord Burleigh's servants bringing money for the exchequer along the same stretch of road. Okay. Theater man, but also parts of his life apparently show up in these plays, right? And,
it does take a lot of money even now to stage theater and to make an investment and a go of it in the theater, the same way that it takes a lot of money to make movies.
Right.
So,
right.
It would, and as we saw on my episode, it was the playground of the nobility. The nobility had to sponsor a group for the group to be able to even work. So,
yeah. Well, here's
stroking my chin.
Yes. Here's a note on that. So
I'm stroking my spear.
Right. Where did Where did Shakespeare get the money early on, at least before he had the King's Men Company, at least? Well, his patron was the Earl of Southampton. Who was the Earl of Southampton? The Earl of Southampton was a childhood friend of Edward de Vere. And there's no documented evidence that Shakespeare ever met the Earl of Southampton, but he's like noted as the patron, right? So anyway, okay. Now here's another thing. A couple things, and these will come up throughout the show, but let me give you the ones that I found the most compelling. Correspondences between the work of William Shakespeare and the life of Edward de Vere. There are many of these. I'm giving you a couple. English pirates in Hamlet. So as we know, Hamlet was a story that has been told many, many, many times. One thing that William Shakespeare did is he added this this ambush of Hamlet by pirates. The basic story is that, Prince Hamlet is set naked upon the shore, having been attacked and stripped of his clothes by pirates in the English Channel. That's a novel insertion into the Hamlet story by William Shakespeare. It turns out that Oxford was dealt with in the exact same manner on a return trip to England in 1576. We'll talk more about that trip. Another example, not as convincing, but it's there. In King Lear, we have the king figuring out how to administer his estate among 3 daughters during his lifetime. Well, de Vere had to experience a very similar task late in his life with his 3 daughters. And while we don't get the sense that, 2 of the daughters hated him like they did in King Lear, it was incredibly contentious, this figuring out who gets what. We'll see a few more of these as we go. Another thing is there is a very mysterious £1,000 a year annuity or fund that the Queen Elizabeth I started giving to Edward de Vere in 1586.
It's a lot of money.
It is, according to one source, it's approximately $300,000 to $500,000 a year. Other top officials would get something like £100 a year from the monarchy. And there was only one other person who ever got this kind of annuity from Queen Elizabeth, and that was a guy, what was his name? Do I have his name? Lord Walsingham, who ran a network of spies.
Okay.
So the money had to go through a different route than normal funding. Some Oxfordians will claim that this £1,000 annuity was basically because they were paying de Vere to write pro-nationalist, pro-Queen Elizabeth propaganda into his plays. It was a psychological operation, and they were funding him for that purpose.
Wow, nothing changes. That rocks.
Right? Now, the official story...
That's 100% what you would do.
Right?
You would totally do the same thing. Yeah. And you've got to understand where the globe was. Like, you could walk from Westminster.
Yeah.
Like, you could walk from the palace. I mean, it'd be a bit of she wouldn't walk, but I mean, you understand what I mean. It's a stone's throw away.
It would be ridiculous to assume that the government didn't know exactly what was happening.
It was totally involved and had of course.
Yeah.
As then, so today.
Right. Now, right. Now, the official story is that Edward de Vere was so spent so much money and screwed things up so badly that Queen Elizabeth gave him this money just so just so De Vere didn't make the nobility look bad. And if it weren't for the fact that he's like the only person getting this, I'd kind of believe it, because we're going to see in the life story that this dude could fumble a bag like no one has ever fumbled a bag in history. So we're gonna see that. Here's another thing. This is fringe, and I'm not even making an argument for it. I'm just going to tell you that this exists. There is another theory called the Tudor Prince theory, and this is the theory that when De Vere was a fairly young man, he had an affair with Queen Elizabeth I, who was older than him by 17 years. That she got pregnant. The child from that was Lord Walsingham, who was the Earl of
Say it with me,
Southampton.
Brad. Walsingham.
Walsingham. Yeah. I'm gonna screw a lot of those up.
You're fine.
I can't.
I'm sure I screwed a bunch up too.
Yeah. So anyway, the idea would be that the funding was somehow about to keep quiet about that, or keep the money going to the Earl of Southampton or something, right? I don't give this much credence. Apparently, Queen Elizabeth did kind of have a crush on Edward de Vere, and we're going to talk about that, but I don't necessarily give any credence to this particular theory. It's just out
age gap. Right. Hell yeah.
Right.
Listen,
Okay.
if the queen is 17 years your senior and she's getting all, she's got smoke coming out of her ears for you.
Yeah. We got to
You
go
do
for
what
it.
it takes. You
do what it takes for the queen and country.
She's the sovereign.
Right.
Yeah. Well, that's the old saying, is like, lie back and think
who are you to tell her no?
Right, of course. Yeah. Right. She has sovereign authority granted to her by God right. himself.
Yeah.
You do what she says.
Yeah. Now, okay. I got one more thing here.
It's hot in here, man. Go on.
Just tell me exactly what to do.
You really don't hear about like queen fetish, like royalty fetish.
It's out.
Not really
there.
a thing.
Sure
well, everything's out there. Everything's out there.
Yeah. That's right.
I guarantee if we went to look, there's probably Queen Elizabeth and Edward de Vere like pornographic fan fiction, and if there isn't, you can now generate it very rapidly with ChatGPT.
It's true. It's true.
It's a great freaking idea. I mean, dude, if this podcasting thing doesn't work out, like, and we do need your support, folks. We've kind of plateaued on Patreon. Get on there, patreon.com/Art of Dark Pod. If this doesn't work out, dude, we can just start banging out. Like, we could literally do an Art of Darkness erotica series using ChatGPT and just jam like Elizabeth and de Vere. Who else? Sylvia Plath, all of it. Just the worst
John Berryman
pornography.
The people are clamoring for it.
The people, it gets the people going. I guarantee there's some factory just producing like smut, with AI right now.
Just
get
Amazon into the AI slop game, guys.
AI slop smut. No, we're not going to do that.
No,
that sounds horrible.
Yes, it does. Okay, so one other thing. All right, talking about de Vere. So we've made something of an argument that de Vere could have been the man who wrote Shakespeare. Why does the conspiracy continue, sort of, right? We did talk about how his sons-in-law, the Herbert boys, who were, I'm calling them the Herbert boys, which is kind of funny because they were like high-level nobility, right? They were noblemen who married the daughter of a nobleman. They were, they were indirectly related to the sovereign. But after them, what's the deal here? Why does it keep going? Well, we got to talk about Nicholas Rowe for a second. Nicholas Rowe was a poet who wrote the first critical biography of Shakespeare. And this is I'm getting from a woman, Oxfordian researcher named Bonner Cutting. Nicholas Rowe was associated with the poet Alexander Pope, who was one of the leading English men of letters in the early 18th century, a man known to be a schemer and strategizer, in addition to being a great writer. These two were friends, Rowe and Alexander Pope, and they were also friends with another guy, a former actor named Thomas Betterton. And together, the three of them, according to Bonner Cutting, and this is at least largely true, kind of worked together to develop this first critical Shakespeare biography. What is the value of that? Well, other than just selling a major book, not only did Nicholas Rowe put out the biography, a year after Nicholas's death, Alexander Pope put out his own edition of the complete works of Shakespeare, copying word for word pretty much the biography used by Nicholas Rowe. And that was the official biography of Shakespeare for like 100 years. What's wrong with it? It appears that Thomas Betterton, who was doing the field research, kind of made a lot of it up. And after, by the end, the end of by 1800 or so, all kinds of holes in this critical biography had opened up. But at that time, they were already in full-on Shakespeare craze, right? Here's some evidence to them making stuff up as well. The image that they used in the Alexander Pope's complete Shakespeare, which became an influence on later interpretations of what Shakespeare looked like, was just an anonymous engraving that was in Alexander Pope's library and nobody knew who it was. So they're just like, well, that guy kind of looks like the Drew Shout portrait from the folio, so we'll just use that and we'll say that's him. But it's just a guy. It's just a random dude that they pulled off the shelves, and they're like, that's Shakespeare. And the guy who did the engravings for the book was a known fraudster who'd made BS maps and dated them to the 1500s and sold them to antiquarians around London, right? So they're just hucksters. Now, similar
Rocks.
things.
That's everything in history is this. Everything.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. There's similar flim-flam we're not going to talk about, but there's similar flim-flam around the 1769 Shakespeare Jubilee. And that's when like full-on Bardology came about. Full-on Shakespeare is the great man, the great poet of England, right? So every kind of step along the way has these sort of fishy little things that occurred. So I'm done with my arguing basically for Shakespeare not being written by Shakespeare. I'm done with my trying to present you the Oxfordian side, why it's Oxford. Kevin, where do you sit with this stuff before I get into the Vere biography?
I don't think Willie Shakes ever existed. I'm aghast at my episode. It's so cringe that I somebody with a degree in history from the University of Minnesota, go Gophers, would have fallen for this lie.
We all did. We all did. I believed it. I believed it until literally, I believed in the original story until June 1st. I believed in the original story.
2024, hundreds and hundreds of years after the lie was fabricated. No, I don't know. Again, like I said, I don't have any skin in the game. I can see it from both sides. I really can. It is shocking that there's so little primary evidence, because this was we had history from this period. History, of course, by the way, is, well, go ahead. Yeah.
Well, I was going to say, we have, when you compare it to the other writers of the time of a similar stature, that's what's odd. You would expect stuff to be lost, but Kevin, you're a writer. How many pieces of paper could someone pull together that indicate that you have something to do with writing?
Oh, plenty. Yeah, there's plenty.
Right.
I mean, there's a record. There'd be a record at Texas. There'd be, I mean, there's plenty. There's enough to know that I was a middling American playwright with a floundering career. I got a new radio play coming out this summer. It's about AI, and it's going to be great. It's called Basilisk. Y'all got to check it out. It's going to be coming very soon, so stay tuned for that. We're gonna release a little snippet of it. Anyway, but no, of course. I mean, and I'm a nobody, and it's like. Yeah, and then all this, and Shakespeare's like, so it's very, very, very shocking that they wouldn't have. I mean, and it's worth noting too for people that history is not the past. History is the record of the past. History is our accounting of the past. So the fact that there's like next to no primary record, like, could you convict him in court of writing these plays? No. That's what Diana Price and the Oxfordians claim. Yeah, that's wild.
Yeah, he's not guilty. Yeah.
And interesting.
And I think maybe I made this point earlier, but a lot of the Stratfordians are English literature types, which is great. But there's a lot of specialized information that they have. And a lot of the Oxfordians don't necessarily come from that world. They come from other worlds, and they start off sort of interested in Shakespeare. A lot of them are lawyers, for instance, or historians, but people that don't have skin in the game on the identity, they just kind of start out curious, right? But if you think about what the actual question is, the question isn't one of sophisticated interpretation of texts necessarily. It's about pulling together documents and figuring out the context and putting together circumstantial evidence. And English literature people don't have any monopoly on that endeavor. They just don't, right? So, yeah, so very interesting. I don't come out of this necessarily believing it's De Vere, but I'm pretty convinced that the mainstream story that William Shakespeare, man from Stratford, wrote all these plays in a decades long fit of genius. I don't buy it anymore. So in the After Dark, we're going to talk about two other candidates, and in brief, I'm going to give you the argument as to why those people could have been. One of them is Mary Sidney, the Countess of Pembroke, and the other one is Christopher Marlowe. We're going to talk about in the After Dark for patrons and Substack subscribers at Art of Dark Pod. Okay. Now we're talking De Vere. Now we're just talking about his life. Some Shakespeare stuff's going to come up, but we're just talking about the wild, wonderful world of being Edward de Vere, which we actually do know much more about than Willie Shakes. Again, my primary source for this is a biography of Edward de Vere written by a Stratfordian. So I did this somewhat intentionally, thinking, the Oxfordians are going to have their biases. This guy's going to have his biases. If we come through this biography and we still think there's a case for Edward de Vere, it's pretty interesting, I think. So what do we know about this guy? 17th Earl of Oxford. There were barely 17th of anything, very high number. It was among the most established royal families in the entire kingdom. Their earldom, their land holdings, that is, were largely in Essex and Middlesex counties, and they were vast. I think they were like maybe the third largest landowner under before Edward de Vere took over. They had an industry under them producing timber and agricultural products. His father, obviously the 16th Earl of Oxford, through his father's grandmother, he was related to royalty. King Edward III was Edward de Vere's 5x great grandfather. Okay. So let's read quickly through the like a quick rundown of the history of the earls. It's kind of interesting, actually. I got weirdly interested in the like Elizabeth, like Henry VIII to King James I history. So let's see. This is just a quick rundown of some of the earls. Let's see. Quote, Aubrey III, first Earl of Oxford, who came to England with William the Conqueror in 1066, was possibly the original builder of Castle Hedingham. Robert, third Earl of Oxford, one of the peers who forced King John to sign the Magna Carta. Robert, ninth Earl of Oxford, scandalous favorite of Richard II. Richard, 11th Earl of Oxford, was a commander at Agincourt in 1415. John, the 12th Earl of Oxford, was beheaded 6 days after his eldest son Aubrey suffered the same fate under Edward IV on Tower Hill, 1462. The 13th Earl, another John, the 12th Earl's second son, led a life of fabulous adventure. Born in 1443 and thus a minor when his elder brother and father were executed, at his majority he achieved a reversal of his father's attainder, was restored to the title, and created a king of the Bath. Sent to the Tower in November 1468, he was released before January 1469, but soon offended King Edward IV by supporting Henry VI. Vainly opposing Edward at the Battle of Barnet, John fled to France. In 1473, he attempted to return, but retreated before superior odds, fetching up at St. Michael's Mount off Cornwall. Forced to surrender, he was shipped off to Hams near Calais, now attained in his own person. And there's a few other things, but this is the story. When you're an Earl, 17 generations back kind of what happened, right? It's crazy.
Love it. It's so absurd that the peasants like us don't have this. It's really strange. Like, I have my family traced back to the 16th century because of my stepfather, and because we are Catholics, we're part of the one true faith. So we have the church records, but that's like it.
You don't know
And
much about them. You just know like a
sure.
couple dates.
Yeah. I
Yeah.
mean, and I had a great grandfather die in a gruesome farm accident in North Dakota. I know that, but
Mhm.
like, it's kind of crazy and not discussed very much, but like this current generation, those of us who have been sucked into the digital reality, assuming that the EMP or the solar flare doesn't knock it all out, like if the internet still exists in even remotely a recognizable way in 1,000 years, there will be a record of us. I mean, and
Mhm.
our shit'll be out there.
Yeah,
That's a new thing. Like we don't
it
have
is.
there's nothing like that, and that's not discussed very often. Like I might put a QR code on my grave.
Right.
You know,
Right.
like I mean, it's strange and it's
Yeah.
very bizarre that and of course this is even he was an exception. I mean, you've got your
Mhm.
lineage traced back 17 times. I mean,
Right.
it's just like,
Wild. Yeah.
yeah,
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 it's
yeah,
very
yeah,
different reality. Yeah, it's a
yeah,
very
yeah,
different.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah, and
Very
I've heard
interesting.
somebody say that like a really good reason to podcast is so for your descendants, they've got a bunch if they want a bunch of listening to you talk. That's
Sure.
like really insight,
There's some value into it, in
Mhm.
theory.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
what not to do.
Right.
I'm speaking to my great grandchildren right now. Here's what I'm going to tell you: buy Bitcoin.
Buy Bitcoin.
Like, buy Bitcoin. I don't know. Buy
Yeah.
the dip. Buy the dip. Buy
Yeah,
low, sell high.
whatever they
Okay.
got, whatever they
I'm
got at that
I'm
time.
literally
Yeah.
great great grandson Anthony, because Anthony's our family name. Great great
Mhm.
Anthony grandson. I'm working my ass off right now to make sure you don't have to live hand to mouth like I do
Mhm.
on my. I'm only making $250,000 a year. Have you seen that on Twitter? We were
Yeah.
laughing about
Yeah.
that in the green room. There's this
Yeah.
discourse going around that Americans aren't able to live on 250,000, and Brad was like,
Right.
skill issue. I mean, literally. And
Yeah.
I know you can do the math and okay, whatever. But yeah, no, that's so strange. And it's like peasants are just not supposed to live in history. I mean, like
Right.
we're just
Right.
supposed to just live check to check, and that's like our
Right. And it's
reality. And
a
meanwhile, these
no, because
fuckers have been like,
you're making money for Edward de Vere's of the
right, of
world.
course. Yeah,
And
right,
that
right, right.
system's like not exactly in place the way it was, but it's like the
It's
faint imprint of it is still
There,
there for
there are
sure.
the imprint
Yeah.
is not that faint,
Yeah.
Brad. It's pretty,
Right. Well, yeah, yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Every
Yeah.
mortgage you take out, is
Mhm.
sending. It's literally sending some money to New York or London or Frankfurt or all
Mhm.
of the above.
Yeah.
But they've just fragmented it into a million pieces,
Yeah.
And
So
if you could,
nothing
nobody's
belongs to any
quite to
belong.
blame,
Yeah.
But
Right.
yeah, they
Yeah.
still they still send their children to the private schools in
Yeah.
Switzerland and. Yeah.
Indeed.
I'm
Indeed.
going to step up and
Yeah.
I'll be right back. Okay. These
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
rest are keep
Gotcha.
going, Brad. You're
Yeah.
crushing it.
Yeah, so John, which is Edward's father, the 16th Earl of Oxford, he maintained a company of theatrical players, and the family had done this since 1492. It was family tradition to patronize and manage sort of a group of theatrical players. For a while, John de Vere was the Great Chamberlain, which is a largely ceremonial position with some administrative powers in the monarchy. Excuse me, throughout Queen Mary's reign from 1553 to 1558, that's Bloody Mary, for people who don't know. Bloody Mary was married to the King Philip of Spain and is best known for her vicious efforts to reverse the Reformation. Under Bloody Mary, the most notable thing that John de Vere did, the 16th Earl, he was the principal magnate of Essex, and he helped to apprehend Protestant rebels and traitors. And in 1555, he was commended for his supervision of burning heretics. So he got like a medal or applauded or something because he helped to set a bunch of Protestants on fire. Um, this was while De Vere was alive. De Vere was born in 1550. Okay, so John de Vere took his first wife, Dorothy, with whom he had one surviving daughter. Dorothy was the daughter of an earl, obviously. In 1546, John de Vere married Dorothy. Dorothy was also the daughter of an earl. In 1546, she left John de Vere, Edward de Vere's father, due to unkind behavior, and he entered into a bigamous marriage with a commoner. But then Dorothy died in 1548, and the earl needed to indicate that their marriage wasn't broken. And then this meant that they needed his commoner wife to keep her mouth shut. How did they get his commoner wife to keep her mouth shut? Well, I'm going to read just a little bit to you. Quote, presumably the earl simply abandoned Anne, that's the commoner wife, who had no claim on him. His separation from Joan Jockey, this was another woman he was involved with, was expedited by an act of gut-wrenching violence. One day, when the Earl had left Joan Jockey alone, a gang of 5 approached her residence in Earl Colne. These were Sir Thomas Darcy, Lord Sheffield, John Smith, Richard Enos, and another servant. The servants broke in Joan's door, then pinned her down while Smith spoiled or disfigured her. In point of fact, John Smith cut her nose. Presumably, Smith either cut her nose clean off or cut the skin at the base of the nostrils into flaps to give her a permanently grotesque appearance, traditional punishment for unsocial behavior. Though Joan Jockey survived the attack, the Earl definitively put her away. Walworth believed that Joan Jockey was still alive in 1585, but none of the examinants could depose as to her current whereabouts. So Edward de Vere's father gets entangled with some commoner women, and to get one of them away from him, get one of these women away from him, he sends his goons to go slice her face up.
Ouch. I don't like it.
Yeah.
Not good.
No.
Yeah, it's helpful to think of these nobles as essentially like mafioso.
Oh, yeah.
And it's pretty, and it's the same thing. It's been the same way forever.
We're going to see that.
Crazy.
We're going to see that in De Vere, there's a reason this biography is called Monstrous Adversary. Okay. He was, we're going to see. It's wild. Okay. Edward de Vere's mother would be John's, basically sort of his third wife, a woman named Marjorie Golding. She was the daughter of a knight, which is a notch below in terms of class, but she was apparently a very beautiful woman. And so John de Vere married her anyway. This would cause issues between the more noble bloodline, which was Edward's older half-sister, and himself, who is technically a half-breed in terms of noble status. His father's an earl, and his mother comes from a knight. So, should he be an earl? There's kind of debates, and I think there's even a lawsuit about this at one point. Anyway, 1550, April 12th, young Edward de Vere is born, named after the new young king. Okay, de Vere's childhood. At 8 years old, de Vere entered Queen's College, Cambridge, which they sometimes did for the children of nobility. He ends up being tutored at first by this guy, Thomas Fowle, who was actually a secret Protestant minister for a time, because when de Vere was 8, it was Bloody Mary was reigning. So you weren't allowed to be a Protestant, and then a few months would go by and you weren't allowed to be a Catholic. It's very confusing times to just be a normal person. It's like, I thought I was supposed to do this. I'm not supposed to do that. Now I'm a criminal. Uh-oh. Yeah.
It's just a really long civil European civil war. If you think of Europe as Christianity as having a Eurocentric identity, and it's just this long civil war between the north and the south of Europe, sort of, but then also people inside each of the countries, and it goes on to this day.
Yeah. And it's a prominent factor in De Vere's life.
And one of the reasons the West is just totally eroded is because we don't have a unified Christianity. It's one of the great tragedies of history, in my opinion, but we'll leave that aside. Here we are.
Well, they couldn't stop fighting about it back then. How are they going to do it now?
Well, I mean, it's just, but nobody in American public schools will say, okay, children, those of you of European descent have been living through a 500-year civil war, and Catholics stand over there. Nobody wants to talk about it, but
that's true. That's true.
Yeah, it's if you think it's very Dune pilled, to be honest. But it's for another day.
Yeah, well, more of it's going to come up here. So
okay, good.
When De Vere was 12, his father died, and not before his father could bind him in a marriage contract to either one of the 2 daughters of the Earl of Huntingdon. This is how you did it. When you're nobility, you were straight. It was very Bene Gesserit. You're setting things up, right? Now, De Vere was left an enormous inheritance to Edward de Vere. This was control of all of their lands, which was a hefty income by itself,
giant
as well as
tracts of land.
Yeah, that's right. Plus, just a cash £666. Which is about $200,000 to $300,000, very, very roughly in today's dollars.
Which is very hard to live on.
Yeah, right.
Check.
And Plus, when you have an agricultural empire, right?
Right.
That's fully functioning.
Living hand to mouth. Yeah.
Right.
Oh, it's so funny
Who's
too
also
because again that argument that only a man of the country would know all of these names for things. It's like no, dude, the dude literally owned a not
right.
insignificant fraction of England. Like
Yeah, yeah.
and
And
their
he
wealth
liked
was
going to the
totally
country.
based on the land. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah,
yeah.
yeah. Yeah.
So
He didn't
yeah.
like being in London. He spent time in London, but he would go
You'd have
stay
to
out
go
in the
for this.
country.
You'd have to go for the season, right?
Hmm.
Yeah,
Right,
like
right.
people in like anybody in with money who lives in New York. The first thing they do is leave in the summer, and they leave
Right.
for long weekends all the time.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah,
So some
yeah.
guy who lives in New York and, whatever, he's making a $500,000 a year, but he
Yeah,
also knows how to chop
that's
wood. And you're
chump
like, he
change.
must be a farmer.
Yeah, it's like no, no. He just has a play. He just has a home in
Yeah.
Beacon or whatever.
Right.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah, yeah. Hmm.
Right. Another thing that was inherited by young Edward de Vere was the title of Lord Great Chamberlain, which, according to Alan Nelson in this book, Monstrous Adversary, was basically an ornamental position. You didn't really have to do anything. It sounds like a big deal, Lord Great Chamberlain, but there's really no significant responsibility. It's sort of an ornamental title. Now, when his father dies, based on the laws at the time, though his mother was still alive, and if you were a noble, if your father died, you became a ward of the state. And this means you're a ward of the Queen, of Queen Elizabeth I at this time. And he gets assigned to a man named William Cecil or Lord Burleigh. And Lord Burleigh, among many other things, was responsible. He was the Queen's principal secretary, and among other things, he was the master of the wards. So any young noble person who'd not reached the age of majority, if their father had died, Lord Burleigh basically assumed responsibility for them. Um, and he was one of the most, he was probably the most, during Queen Elizabeth's reign, Lord Burleigh was probably the most powerful man in the country. There's really not even, there really wasn't anybody else that was quite had as much power as he did. Um, so anyway, De Vere, along with a number of other wards, would live in his home and receive his education there. I want to spend a little bit of time here because um, the De Vere hypothesis, as I said, introduced by J. Thomas Loney, and one of the big things is that how to say this the best way. So well before the De Vere theory came about, well before J. Thomas Loney put this down, people had suggested that Polonius from Hamlet was inspired by Lord Burleigh. And many people apparently thought this. This was a relatively mainstream opinion. Um, De Vere, De Vere basically grew up knowing Lord Burleigh, and De Vere would be in constant correspondence with Lord Burleigh until Lord Burleigh died in 1598, I believe.
So you imagine being Lord Burleigh and you show up to the premiere of Hamlet and that character comes off and starts giving those ridiculous speeches and everybody's cracking up.
Right,
It must
right,
have been
right.
riotous. You think he maybe got red in the face, or is it more a case of like, do you think he watched it and said, "What a fool"?
Right. He probably did.
I
Well,
can't
this
believe
is
that Polonius.
the,
What a
yeah.
something. He reminds me of somebody.
Yeah. There's something weird about Lord Burleigh as you read this. It's like he's clearly intelligent. Like he's not an idiot, but he does have a certain sense. He does have like a certain naivete where like sometimes you're like, dude, what? Like, how are you letting Edward de Vere get away with this for like the seventh time? What is going on here? um, de Vere would actually marry Lord Burleigh's daughter and Lord Burleigh's and have children with her, right? So they're very much entwined. The Lord Burleigh's family and the Oxford family. Um yeah. So okay, education. He's being privately tutored, De Vere is, by this guy named Lawrence Noel. Lord Burleigh's got too much to do. He's not actually tutoring the kids. He's administering sort of almost like think of like a homeschool group, and then he assigns the kids to tutors. Um, De Vere's tutor, this guy Lawrence Noel, said of his 13-and-a-half-year-old pupil, quote, "I clearly see that my work for the Earl of Oxford cannot be much longer required. The Stratfordians and the Oxfordians interpret this in two radically different ways. The Oxfordians say, see, he was a genius. He was 13 and a half, and his tutor's like, I got nothing to teach him. The Stratfordians will say that no, Edward de Vere was a little punk and the tutor was sick of him. I couldn't tell you which of those is true. Could be either one of them. Could be both of them.
This is one of the things about language too. So, as the great poet said in the greatest rock and roll song ever conceived, sometimes words have two meanings.
Do they?
Yeah, it's a pain in the ass.
Could they have more than two
They could have
meanings?
more than two
That's
meanings.
crazy.
Yeah, yeah. It's a real problem, dude.
It's a problem.
It creates problems.
Yeah. Creates lawyers too.
Oh,
Yeah.
it does, doesn't it?
Yeah,
Yeah.
it does. That's kind of why they exist.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, lawyers are the instantiation of a need to make language mathematical.
Sort of. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And it's
That's
not,
why
and it
people
never
get,
will be.
yeah. That, it's funny. It's like, and I sometimes share this opinion, but like people will sort of almost mock legalese. And it's like, the reason it's like that is because every time it's not like that, somebody sues somebody. That's the whole reason it's like that. It's
It
it does
has
suck.
to
It's
be
kind of
like that.
annoying. Yeah,
Yeah.
it has to be
Yeah.
like that or else somebody sues somebody. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah.
Anyway, here is an example of the kind of education that Edward de Vere got. William Shakespeare, no clearly documented education. Here's what de Vere was learning. Quote, confident of his grasp of pedagogy and child psychology, Cecil drew up orders for the Earl of Oxford's exercises in his own hand. The young Earl was to rise in such time as he may be ready to his exercise by 7 o'clock. Then he was to follow a daily regimen. 7 to 7:30, dancing. I don't know why you start the day dancing, but that's what they did.
Well, you do calisthenics. You got to get the blood
Right.
flowing.
You got to get moving. Yeah.
Yeah.
7:30 to 8, breakfast. 8 to 9, French. 9 to 10, Latin. 10 to 10:30, writing and drawing. Then common prayers, and then so to dinner. 1 to 2, cosmography. 2 to 3, Latin. 3 to 4, French. 4 to 4:30, exercises with his pen. Then common prayers, and so to supper. On holy days, Oxford was to, quote, read before dinner the epistle and gospel in his own tongue and in the other tongue after dinner. All the rest of the day to be spent in riding, shooting, dancing, walking, and other commendable exercises. Quite an education, really, for the time.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
Very,
What do we know about
very contrary to the Lord of the Flies scenario that I recall from my education.
He learned a lot more than I did, that's for sure.
Well, he did. Well, there are so many things I could say right now. I'm just going to leave it.
Okay. I'm a lot more
my,
I have a lot more in common with William
oh,
Shakespeare than Edward de Vere, to be honest.
let's just
Yeah.
say that. Yeah. Can you
Yeah.
imagine public schools we're devoting 2 hours a day to Latin?
Riots.
Riots. I mean, oh God, I didn't even know. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Jeez.
Yeah. So now let's try to talk about his personality. It's very difficult to get much insight into what de Vere was doing as a very young man or what he was like as a very young man. But one thing we know is how the money got spent, and clearly that tells us something. So he'd inherited 666 pounds, which, as we know, was approximately $200,000 to $300,000, very roughly into this money.
That was as an annuity. That was annually.
No, that was just that was a pile of cash. All of the regular money was going to come from the land.
Was from the land. Okay.
Yeah.
So you inherited a nice chunk. Throw that right into Doge.
Right.
That's the 5x
just
that.
let it sit.
Be all right.
Yeah, keep an eye on it. But
yeah.
But this is at a time, 666 pounds. This was at a time where living on 100 pounds a year was a damn good living, right? Like 100 pounds was, that you were doing pretty well. And he also didn't have any expenses at this time. He was a ward of the state. So he wasn't paying for his meals or anything. He was taken care of, basically. In 4 years, from 1862, when his father died, to 1866, we know that Edward de Vere spent more than the entire inheritance on clothing, apparel, rapiers, and daggers. He's just a teenage boy, just dressing super flashy and buying weapons. That's his whole shtick. And we know that his mother made efforts even to protect the earldom's finances as long as she could. She would write in letters expressing concern when he was a teenager that his extravagant lifestyle would threaten the estates when he came to majority. And let me read just a little bit. I think this is a letter This is a letter. Oh, you know what? I don't actually have that. No, never mind. Oh, yeah, yeah, I do. Quote. Long before his 17th birthday, which occurred in 1567, Oxford evinced deeply rooted habits of self-importance and fiscal extravagance, spending heavily on clothes, personal weapons, horses, and retainers. He had received the dedication of one book and the gift of 2 university degrees without the effort on his part. Honor, like wealth, came not for what he did, but for who he was. Now, in 1866, as it's kind of alluded to there, he was given an honorary master's degree along with 11 other recipients from the nobility by the University of Cambridge. According to Oxfordians, such as Alex Waugh, this was a real honor that reflected De Vere's passion and ability and his intelligence, right? But according to Alan Nelson, this was purely functional, kind of an honorific given because the Queen wanted it. It was like he had a degree, but it's like whenever you get an honorary degree from a college, like, I don't know, all kinds of actors and stuff get them, right?
Yeah, Bill Cosby was given a lot of
For some reason, I
honorary
thought of Bill
degrees.
Cosby
Yeah,
too. Yeah.
yeah,
So
Bill.
it's like
Yeah, good
saying,
old Bill
saying,
Cosby.
right? It's like, wow, saying Bill Cosby's got 12 master's degrees. That's amazing. Or doctorates. That's amazing. You're
Yeah,
like, no, no,
yeah.
none of them actually mean anything.
Right. It is meaningless. Yeah, he's a
So
doctor
that's,
of he's a doctor of comedy and
well, sure.
pharmacology.
Ooh, well, hey,
Didn't he
man.
get? Didn't he
Yeah,
get released? He got released, didn't he?
he did. They found some weird technicality.
Some
It's
loophole
like,
or something. There you go. The
yeah,
lawyers are back at it.
the lawyers. Yeah, yeah, exactly. Some
Back at
word
it.
meant 2 different things. Yeah.
Mm.
Now, where does all of this extravagance, does all this, what is that term that they were trying to use a couple of years ago? Affluenza. Does that have any negative consequences immediately? Well, let's see. On Wednesday, 23rd July 1567, at 17 years and 3 months old, that is, in the backyard of Cecil House, Oxford killed a man. Entering the yard between 7 and 8 o'clock in the evening with Edward Bainham, a Westminster tailor, Oxford practiced the science of defense with rapiers. Thomas Bricknell, an undercook, evidently in the Cecil household, happened by. Whether by Brecknell's unwanted interference or by Oxford's deliberate act, the Earl's foil pierced the thigh of the unarmed man, and Bricknell was dead before midnight. His body was carried to
Whoa.
Cecil House to await the coroner.
A foil is a very thin blade. It's like the first blade that you learn to use when you learn fencing.
Yeah,
It literally, I think, means flower. It's a
yeah.
very basic weapon
Mhm.
and very thin blade. I mean, yeah, I could see how it could kill you,
Well,
but you'd have to
if you
if you
pierce the
hit the
femoral
carotid.
artery,
Yeah,
yeah,
is it
he
the
got him in the
femoral
thigh,
or the? Yeah, oh, the
femoral, yeah,
femoral. Okay, yeah, yeah, yeah.
yeah, and he
Damn,
died.
maybe
And
that was. I
apparently,
mean, yeah,
yeah,
yeah. Eugh, what
apparently
a way
there
to go.
was, well, just bleeding out, right, right,
Ugh.
and
There's nothing anybody can do.
probably
Yeah.
apologizing to the Earl, like, I'm sorry that you did this to me, like, because you're going to be in trouble, because he's the
Ugh,
Earl.
what a
You're just
nightmare.
some dude.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's like
Ugh.
when Dick Cheney shot that guy in the face. Remember that?
Sure.
And that
Sure.
guy had to apologize publicly for getting
Sure.
shot in the
Sorry.
face.
Sorry for getting shot in the face. That's
Sorry
the
to cause you
American.
all
That's
this
the new
trouble.
American dream now, man.
Right. Get shot
You
in the
want to
face
get
by an oligarch.
if you could right, yeah. If you can get
Yeah.
shot in the face by somebody who once had a seven-figure book deal, that's the
Right.
American dream now.
Right.
You're getting a
Yeah.
little bit of collateral riz
Yeah.
off of an oligarch. That
Yeah.
rocks.
Yeah. Now, apparently, one of the things that was a little sus about this is there was a guy who taught Oxford and other people fencing stuff, and he brought this technique, I think, from the continent that was very much frowned upon, which was basically just stabbing with the foil. It was considered ungentlemanly to just
To
stab
not
directly forward, not
really.
like actually make
You'd have to
maneuvers.
like slash or something rather than stab. Well, because
Apparently,
stabbing would cause wounds. Yeah, if you flicked a stab, if you flicked, you could make your
you,
point.
you
There
could
were
and you
different
could cut
types of
somebody.
dueling too, where you would duel to first blood,
Mhm.
without the intent of killing.
Right,
I mean, it was
right,
obviously
right,
extraordinarily dangerous, but
right.
yeah.
Yeah, and
Mm.
so what's not clear is did Oxford accident was this an accident? Was it intentionally trying to murder because of this guy Bricknell had done something, or was Oxford at that age so cruel that he just knew he could get away with it and just did it kind of for kicks? It's not really clear which of these things that it was. What is clear is he totally got away scot-free from it. And Lord Burleigh kind of helped make that happen, right? Polonius, old Polonius, that, anyway. Okay, 1568. We're moving right along here. De Vere turns 18 years old. His mother dies, and then he's out from under William Cecil's thumb. There'd been a marriage arranged from him, which we spoke about earlier, but he ignores that, and he, for a little while, basically is just a rich party animal. He engages in drink, riot, and sexual license. And continued spending crazy amounts of money. Let me see if I can read this bit here. Yeah, let's see. Some of Oxford's preoccupations in his 20th year are revealed in expense accounts. I'm not going to read this. Basically, he's spending money. He's just spending insane quantities of money on everything: food, drink, mostly clothes. He loved buying very expensive clothes. And later in life, he loved buying very expensive clothes and then just not paying for them. Like, he would just hire a tailor to be like, hey, make this. And then he wouldn't pay the tailor, and the tailor would complain, and he'd be like, shut up. I'm the Earl. What are you talking about?
Right. I will thrust with my foil.
Exactly. Exactly.
Rats foiled again.
Yeah, and Oxford is, here's one takeaway. Oxford is a violent thug. He has a penchant for violence, and if it's either him doing it or his men doing it, it's constant throughout most of his life. So the way you talked about the mafias, it's basically a marginally legal gang that he is at the head of. There are stories about how if you wandered onto his land, you'd be threatened and intimidated. Who knows how many people were just killed for poaching on his land? Who would know, right? Well-known highwaymen and other miscreants were known to be working for him. There's a story about how he and his buddies were all hanging out wasted all day, and they started strangling each other with garters to see what it felt like. Very bizarre stuff.
Yeah. Okay, cool.
Yeah. Yeah.
What a freak.
But as he gets older, a lot of it's just chaos when he's like young, 18, 19, 20. But as he gets older, it becomes like more targeted. In 1573, there's a guy who worked for De Vere named George Brown, murdered two guys, apparently at the behest of a certain Mistress Anne Drury. This was a major scandal written about in plays and poems, but De Vere's level of involvement's unknown. But this guy who murdered two people worked for De Vere. It's very confusing what the motivations were. Also in 1573, a servant of De Vere's runs away claiming that De Vere had threatened to poison him. And there are like a half dozen of these sorts of circumstances where a servant runs away from De Vere and like tries to get help from somebody else, and most of the time doesn't get help. And they're running away like either he's not paying me, or he beat me, or he's threatening to kill me, or all three of them, right? It's a regular phenomenon over the next like 15, 20 years. There's also something else that he got involved with starting around 1570. Let me just read this in the biography. Make sure I got the right page. Quote, Oxford's infatuation with the occult may be celebrated in a verse stanza printed in the 1584 Pandora, a pamphlet composed by John Southern and dedicated to Oxford. Quote, this is a little poem. For who marketh better than he the seven turning flames of the sky, or hath read more of the antique, hath greater knowledge in the tongues, or understands sooner the sounds of the learner to love music? Okay. Let me read another little bit. Quote, the 1570s began a long string of necromantic stage plays, including Cleomon and Chlamydes. These aren't De Vere's, but it's just saying there was an occult fad in the late 16th century, early.
Yeah, there's always every X number of years, there's always an occult fad. I think it's permanent now. Is part of America's pagan nature.
Yeah. Indeed. Anthony Munday's poem John a Kent and John a Cumber, and Anthony Munday worked in De Vere's troupe at one point. Christopher Marlowe's Dr. Faustus, Robert Greene in 1592 or thereabouts, Robert Greene's Friar Bacon and Friar Bungay, about 1594. Let's see. Like his stage counterparts, Oxford could, quote, conjure and had often conference with Satan. Or in the Earl Arundel's more elaborate version, quote, he had often seen the devil by conjuring with persons of the chapel. An appropriate picture of Satan survives in the same Folger manuscript, along with instructions on how to address him. Quote, if you wish to invoke the spirit of Satan, make a circle with a well-burnished sword and go over it again with chalk or quicklime. This is something I have tested. But beware that you do not do this for a trifle. And this is something that can be done at any hour, whatever hour you choose. Do this at the midpoint of the hour and be clean and dressed because of the sanctity of the names. Here follows the very invocation which you can compel the demon to appear, and he will immediately give you true responses to your questions whenever you desire to know anything for certain. Thus, knowledge is achieved by contacting devils, in this case, the master devil, Satan. Okay. There's evidence that De Vere visited a man, the Earl of Northumberland, who was considered the wizard earl, and De Vere went and consulted him in astrology and alchemy. In later years, and we'll talk about this a bit later in the biography, in later years, De Vere was accused, during a period of confinement, basically house arrest, he was accused of having, quote, painted out a book of prophecies at the direction of the devil. So yeah. Occult violence.
Well, there's a lot of
thuggery.
occult stuff in Shakespeare.
There is.
I mean, and if he's into violent thuggery, then that would be right where Romeo and Juliet came out of. I mean, that's about kind of rival gangs.
Mhm.
You know.
Yeah.
What a real
When
piece of shit. Wouldn't that
Yes.
be funny too if people had to accept like, no, this rotten, rich, spoiled piece of shit, this trust fund brat wrote
Yeah.
created humanity, invented humanity, as we say, and was a
That's
great
what's
poet.
that's what's one thing was kind of interested. I was not prepared for how much of a piece of shit he was.
I love it.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
it's perfect too because we need this, especially the Anglos
Mhm.
need this like great national poet who's beyond reproach as a
Right.
personality because he didn't fucking exist, because we have no real record of him, so we can be anything we want, right?
hmm
He must have been the
hmm
most sensitive man to ever have lived, of
Right.
course,
The
right?
sweet swan
Just
of
the sweet
Avon.
swan of
Yeah.
Avon. And
Yeah. Gentle.
how
Yeah.
nice is that to imagine your national opponent? Of course he's beyond reproach because there's no there. You can't, you
hmm
throw a dart and it hits nothing.
Right.
Yeah,
Right. Right. Right.
fascinating.
Yeah.
I could see the reason you might not want to peg this on De Vere.
Yeah. Um, so De Vere does turn 21. And once he turns 21, all the bills start coming due. See, one thing is he actually owed the queen for his wardship. The idea was you're going to inherit this agricultural empire as an earl, and you'll pay us back. And it wasn't a ton of money compared to his what he was inheriting overall, but he was blowing his money so fast that when the queen was like, "Hey, you owe us 3,000 pounds," he was like, "Oh yeah, I have no money at all." Um, and he would be constantly in debt till the end. At 21, he was also what they called sued for his livery. Basically, you had to pay the monarchy to get your titles, to actually inherit your titles, to get them applied to you. You had to get your permit, your title permit.
Boy, you got your nobility permit there.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Rocks. That's awesome.
He gets
I
married.
love that it's literally just their whole, it's just the same as it is then as it is now. They had a sword to your neck. Pay up, pay
Right.
up, pay
What am I
up.
paying for? Well, because we told
I
you.
got more guys who will kill more of your guys than your guys can kill my guys. Just pay up.
Yeah.
Pay up.
Yeah.
God
Yeah.
says pay up.
Right.
God
Yeah.
says
Are you
pay up.
questioning God?
You're
Yeah.
questioning God. Are you questioning democracy? Pay up.
Right.
Half your income for life. Pay up. You like
Right.
democracy, don't you? How
Right.
you pay up 50% of your income for life.
Yeah.
Pay up.
Yeah. Yeah. You know what was great too is apparently there was a rule about the nobility. At the time, there were debtor prisons for normal people. Nobility could not go to debtor's prison. They would
No,
not be, that wasn't a crime for them to owe
right.
money.
Of course
Yeah.
not. Yeah.
Yeah.
Based,
Now
incredibly based.
he gets married around the age of 21. Who does he marry? He marries the 15-year-old daughter, Anne, of Lord Burleigh. And I'm not pointing out 15 years old because I think that's particularly weird. Among the nobility, there are all kinds of stuff. I mean, it isn't really that strange. Um, uh, Now, but what this does do is basically locks him into Lord Burleigh's world, right? And this is a very propitious
Sounds
marriage.
like like an old PBS show with puppets and things. Lord
Lord
Burleigh's
Burleigh's
World
world.
on PBS.
Yeah, and you got one puppet with a big mustache and like a monocle. Yeah, yeah.
Yep, 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 yep.
Yeah, so and you can see this is a good marriage. This is a good marriage for Edward de Vere because again, we said Lord Burleigh is like the most powerful man in England. But interestingly, Lord Burleigh didn't quite have the actual station. He sort of had worked his way to that position, unlike everybody else. And there is something about how they had to, so Edward de Vere could marry Anne without like scandal. They had to elevate William Cecil to be Lord Burleigh so that he could marry her. But Lord Burleigh had and that happens in one of the plays actually. That very same thing, and I'm blanking right now which play this happens in, where somebody is elevated so that their daughter is of a higher status, so they can get married. I can't remember at the moment. Somebody maybe will recall this. I thought I had it written down. Um, let's see. Also, this is probably the beginning of a grudge when De Vere gets married to Anne Cecil. This is probably the beginning of a grudge with Philip Sidney that De Vere has, and this will be significant, and we'll talk about it probably a little bit later. This grudge is kind of historical. Philip Sidney was a national hero. His sister was Mary Sidney, the Countess of Pembroke, who we're going to talk about in the After Dark. Um, let's give some historical context here. We're not going to do as deep as we did on the English Civil War and John Milton because we have so many things we have to talk about here, but it's worth kind of knowing what is happening. Um, this is the time period when the whole people may be vaguely familiar, and some of you guys maybe know everything about this, but this is where we have the deal with Queen Mary of the Scots, or Mary Queen of the Scots, and Queen Elizabeth, right? Queen Elizabeth had was reigning, but Mary, Queen of the Scots, also had claim to the throne and was seen as the legitimate heir by many English Catholics. Um, for very complicated reasons we're not going to get into, Mary's reign had come under threat in Scotland in 1567. In fact, she ends up forced to abdicate and leave her 1-year-old son on the throne there. She bounces to London and to try to get the protection of her cousin, Queen Elizabeth. Um, but she was such a threat to the throne that she was confined to castles and things like this. She was basically thrown in prison. And eventually, partially due to this, you get the rising of the North in 1569, in which Catholic nobles tried to depose Queen Elizabeth and put Queen Mary on the throne. It became a proxy war for the Protestants and the Catholics, this whole Mary, Queen of Scots versus Queen Elizabeth thing. Now, the Duke of Norfolk at some point in here had made moves towards marrying Mary, Queen of the Scots, which would have given him tremendous influence over the court and straightened out the whole accession confusion currently at play. Basically, what had happened is Henry VIII had, I think, 3 daughters and a son between 3 women. The son had briefly been king and then died, and then there was confusion about which of the women should be the queen. That's summing it up in the briefest and glossing over some things issue. And some of them had been raised Protestant and some of them had been raised Catholic, the children. The Duke of Norfolk had been caught providing money and support to the Queen, to the Mary Queen of the Scots contingent. De Vere was constantly rumored to be trying to provide aid to the Duke of Norfolk. That probably did happen to some extent. The one thing we have to remember is Queen Elizabeth is on the throne. She's a Protestant. He grew up with his dad literally burning piles of Protestants. So like, what were De Vere's sympathies? It's kind of hard to say, right? Um, so, okay. Generally, though, throughout his life, De Vere, all of the Catholics hoped and thought and prayed that De Vere himself was a Catholic, because if you had a nobleman of that level of prominence, it did suggest that moves could be made and maybe the kingdom would go back to being a Catholic kingdom. Okay, we may touch on that more as it comes up. I should say this, though. In 1572, a gang of De Vere's men were apparently caught, I don't know by whom, in a kind of drunken boat party plot to liberate the Duke of Norfolk and kill certain of the Privy Council members. Privy Council members were sort of like the, I guess you'd call it sort of the executive branch, kind of. They were responsible at a high level for administering justice and things like this.
It'd be like the cabinet.
Something like that. Yeah, 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 yeah. De Vere couldn't be charged with anything, but this whole gang of men all worked for De Vere, who were caught in this plot, right? So
I love a
anyway,
good plot.
yeah, there's a lot of plot.
Literally just
A
a
lot of plotting.
conspiracy. That's all it is, a conspiracy, a
Mhm.
plot.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yep, yep, yep. Now, perhaps most importantly, as De Vere sinks into his role as a feudal lord, he becomes an absolute tyrant. Okay, let me read you a statement that he made when he was in his early 20s. Um, quote, I have no help but of mine own, and mine is made to serve me, and myself not mine. Now, let me interpret that for you. There was a sense amongst the nobility, noblesse oblige, that though you were going to take money from these people and you run these, feudal states, you were basically responsible for taking care of your subjects to a certain degree. That was the
Yeah, well, you
idea,
had, well,
right?
yeah, and you had it was to your advantage to do that. You
Sure.
wanted the peasants to be fertile and to be
Hmm.
productive and to be
Yeah.
healthy, and also they could rise up
If
and
you get enough of them, yeah, yeah, yeah,
yeah,
absolutely.
they could mess you up. There was direct
Yeah.
accountability
Yeah.
in a way that now again it's all just spread out and kind of made
Right.
ambivalent, and it's been
Right.
democratized. They've democratized responsibility for
Right. Yeah, that's
running
good.
the world into the ground. Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah.
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 De Vere's statement here is basically like, those people are here to serve me. I don't have to do anything for them. Like that, that's why I'm the Earl. That they're like that's his whole stance. Like he seemed to like not even really understand that this was just something he'd been born into, that he hadn't done anything to deserve it, right? There was no conception of that. It was just like, no, those people are I take advantage of them. That's why they're here and that's why I'm here. Right. It's just like a yeah. At one point, two former servants of Oxford's file a complaint that Oxford and had other thugs of his shoot at them with muskets in an attempt to intimidate them. Um, De Vere's men in this case were put in prison, and stuff like this happens sort of constantly. Um, what else is going on in De Vere's 20s? Oh, we get his first example of a poem. He wrote this at his country estate, Wivenhoe. He would have pronounced it differently than that, but that I think is the name of it, Wivenhoe. Um, yeah, his first poem that we know. This is entitled "The Earl of Oxford to the Reader." Quote, the laboring man that tills the fertile soil and reaps the harvest fruit hath not indeed the gain but pain, and if for all his toil he gets the straw, the Lord will have the seed. The manchet fine falls not unto his share, on courses cheat his hungry stomach feeds. The landlord doth possess the finest fare, he pulls the flowers, the other plucks but weeds. The mason poor that builds the lordly halls dwells not in them, they are for his degree. Okay. I don't know. People who perhaps are more sophisticated poetically than I am can tell you whether that a person who wrote that would have also written, say, the sonnets. I doesn't seem like a particularly good poem to me. I'm not impressed by it, but who knows? It was also pretty young. I mean, this is his early 20s. Maybe he hadn't found his voice yet, as they say. Um, he's also again,
Gotta get a few more stabbings in before he can
right. Yeah,
finally become
exactly.
the Earl of Oxford that we know and
Right.
love as Willie Shakes.
Right, 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 right.
It does.
I
William Shakespeare sounds like the kind of name that this guy would make up too.
it does.
Yeah.
Right. I don't disagree with that.
I mean,
Yeah.
Shakespeare is sort of threatening, isn't it? It's like,
Yeah.
yeah,
I'll
and
shoot my
the
spear at you.
yeah, and the pen is kind of a spear, and yeah, it's all
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
fishy,
Mm-hmm.
fishy.
Yeah. Now, I can't express to you how poorly he is managing his finances and his empire. It's crazy. Like I said, he fumbled the bag worse than anybody ever has, probably. Let me read you this bit. Quote, again from the Alan Nelson Monstrous Adversary book. Quote, The several vectors of Oxford's life by the close of his 23rd year trended in a decidedly negative direction. Oxford was now well established as courtier, royal favorite, poet, patron, egotist, and thug. His associates included the Queen, peers, courtiers, poets, and proteges, but also the Westminster tailor Edward Bainham, the murderous George Brown, and the violent threesome Danny Wilkins, John Hannam, and Maurice Denis, the Frenchman. Reports circulated that Oxford had deserted his young wife, first in a fit of pique, then out of lewd adventurism. He yearned for foreign travel, solo. He treated the most respectable statesman of England with contempt and quarreled with his father-in-law. Not without reason had Gilbert Talbot, the astute critic of court life, identified the chief impediment to Oxford's advancement as his own fickle head. Okay. Now, as we said, he's married, and we talked about he abandons her. Anne was considered a very beautiful woman. She was the eldest daughter of one of the most influential men in the country. She was a prize marriage. Oxford did not care for her at all. In 1573, the point of his life of that passage, roughly, he was not living with Anne or anywhere near her, and it is possible that they had not even consummated the relationship. They had been married for 2 years. A significant amount of Lord Burleigh's correspondence with his daughter in this time, and with Oxford, in fact, is encouraging and plotting to bring them together so that De Vere might actually produce an heir with her. Or maybe even just come to like her. Why didn't De Vere like her? Well, he claims to have found no affinity for her, and why that might be, an attractive and relatively enculturated woman. We can find no negative characterizations of her in all the correspondence. We can't really say. We can only really speculate. But it's possible and probable that De Vere just did not want to be locked down at all. And it is also quite possible that sexually he was much more interested in young boys than he was in women.
Wee wee
Yeah.
wee.
We're going to talk more about that later, but
Pederasty
yeah.
in the theater? Say it ain't so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, his behavior, we're going to talk more about the boys in a little bit. Now, his behavior in the early 1570s, despite the fact that the Queen seemed to like him and would according to other sources than De Vere, would flirt with him. This whole thing remains kind of weird. In 1574, we know he had a suit of some kind that came before the Queen, and she rebuked him for his unthriftiness. Right? He behaved unseemly for a noble. But he would be forgiven almost always, and his trespasses overlooked. And there's kind of this question. There's one thing to like spend your money poorly, and the Queen's just like, that he's a wild boy. He'll grow up. It'll be fine. There's this other thing where he's committing transgressions. Like he's constantly rumored to be conspiring with Catholics. He's constantly on the edge of like conspiracies against the Queen. And then there's this other thing that he does. He leaves the country without approval. Now, to us, we're like, so what? But apparently at this time, you did not leave the country without approval, especially if you were a nobleman. So what was kind of just days after he was rebuked by the Queen, he just bounces. He takes a small retinue of people, he leaves behind family obligations, and he takes a trip into the Low Countries. You could speculate a lot about what this was about, if he was just traveling or if he was going to meet up with forces who were threatening Queen Elizabeth's reign. There were conflicts in the Low Countries at this time. It was not a place to go if you didn't want to get into a battle, especially if you're a nobleman, right? It could have easily been just kidnapped and murdered for political purposes. It really was an escape. Like when he left London for this, he'd been living at Lady York's house, and he left at 2:00 in the morning, walked to Aldgate, secured a horse, rode 40 miles, and then took a ship to Flanders. He was really trying to sneak out of the country. And the Queen was furious. She sent a retinue of knights. She sent a retinue of knights after him, the gentlemen pensioners. People might know that, group. So he'd asked to travel. She told him no. He'd escaped the country, and she sent a retinue of knights out to go get him. And, it's not just she disobeyed the rules. It was suspicious that he was conspiring. He was out in the Low Countries conspiring against her. Nobody knew what he was out there doing. He would end up being actually gone for a couple months before he was called back. He claimed that while he was gone, he took part in the Battle of Mukerheide, wherein Spanish forces defeated Dutch forces. But according to the records, he missed this battle by 3 months. But he may have witnessed something called the Siege of Leyden. Yeah, I think it's pronounced Leyden. It's attempted siege of Leyden. All this is part of the 80 Years' War. If you want to know more about these kind of historical places he's visiting, this is known as the Dutch Revolt or the 80 Years' War. So he comes back from his unlicensed travel. It's gone a few months. Finds out that when he comes back, his wife makes strident efforts to spend time with him, which he totally rebukes for a while. Eventually, they do come together, and she gets pregnant. This turns out to be a problem for her, as we'll see in a moment. Elizabeth Vere, Edward's first child, was born in 1575 when he was 25 years old. But when she was born, De Vere was already out of the country traveling again, this time with a license, but not to the contentious Low Countries, but to Italy. Okay. Now, it's very important that he's in Italy. Kevin, why might it be important to the Oxfordian case that De Vere was in Italy?
Obviously, he is writing about the Merchant of Venice at one point.
Yeah.
He is writing multiple plays that are set in Italy. Romeo and Juliet.
If you had to take a wild guess at what his headquarters for travel when he was in Italy was, what would you guess?
Was it Venice?
It was
Verona?
Venice, yeah.
Venice. Okay, well, there you go.
He bought a house. He had a house built in Venice. He traveled all around Italy, but for somewhere between 10 and 16 months, his headquarters was in Venice, and he had a lover there. Possibly a dark lady even in Venice. And you know about the dark lady.
Well, there you go,
right?
with the dark lady on my episode. Okay. Brad, you're really mogging me, man. Like, I feel misled. I feel let down.
It's not your fault. Yeah.